Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 209 of the Neurodiversity Podcast. And today we are doing an AMA where we are answering your questions from our Facebook group, the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group. If you want your questions answered next time we do one of these, be sure to join the group and submit your questions. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Let's dive right in. Our first question comes from Cheryl, and she is wondering if we have a topical index of all of our podcasts, and if not, can we create one? So this is a great suggestion, and I'd really love to implement it. Right now, we don't really have a topical index of all of our podcasts. However, you can search our website for various topics that you might be seeking. So if you go to neurodiversitypodcast.com and use the search function, you should be able to come up with some items. We do tag our podcast episodes with specific topics also when we create them, so they should come up with those tags. I've often thought about taking the time to create some topic-specific podcast lists because there's a lot of overlap that might not always be easy to find. However, that has yet to make it to the top of the priority list. So that was more of a logistical question. Let's get into some of the others. Sheldon wants to know about whether or not IQ scores should be determinant of whether you're gifted, and whether or not there's a good argument or insight into where it's limited for multi-exceptional or untested folks. So I think the best way to conceptualize this difference is in this way. There is only one reason that somebody can score very highly on an intelligence test, but there are about 1 million reasons why somebody might score lower than their overall ability. Perhaps that is because of another exceptionality, or it could just be that they aren't feeling well that day. There are so many reasons that could suppress somebody's score. The National Association for Gifted Children specifically advocates for having multiple methods for identifying cognitive giftedness in students because they recognize that having multiple hurdles only serves to create barriers for kids. We should look at their work and a portfolio of what they've accomplished. We can look at their cognitive ability, and we can look at their achievement scores, among other things. There are many different indicators that can show us that a student is gifted, and we should take all of those into account. Christine wants to know about advocating for gifted-affirming education for a twice exceptional kid. Their child has a teacher, and this teacher actually seems like they get Christine's child, but they're also at a loss for how to best support his very unique brain. There are so many schools and teachers who tend to focus on the deficits of our twice exceptional kids rather than their strengths. So when we ask them to also focus on the gifted piece, first of all, many educators don't really know where to go with that. Very few teachers have been trained in differentiation specific to cognitive giftedness. What I advocate for is a strengths-based approach. When we can recognize that students have all of these abilities and strengths that we can leverage, we can start with those, and then we can help them make more and faster progress toward their potential. So what are some of those strengths? Sometimes you have kids who are really highly verbal and they process through language. Sometimes you have kids who are visual spatial thinkers. I think of this as the difference between people who think in words and people who think in pictures. Most of us have a balance of both, but a lot of neurodivergent people lean heavily on one rather than the other. So if we have a kid who is really strong with visual spatial reasoning, but they struggle a lot with verbal comprehension, if the only thing we ask them to do is read and write, they're not going to reach that potential. That's why it's so important to come up with ways to integrate those strengths into the curriculum that we're already using. I would hope that specifically schools that specialize in learning disabilities would have more of those resources and tools at their fingertips. And there are many different strengths that they could explore beyond the ones that I just mentioned here. But that might be a good first step. Christy has a 12-year-old son who struggles with his neurodivergent identity. No matter how they try to support and encourage him, he sees the impacts of his diagnoses as failures. And now that he's older, they are trying to encourage him to learn more about ADHD, autism, and giftedness and how they impact his own experience so he can develop a self-awareness that can lead to self-advocacy. However, every time ADHD or autism is mentioned, he shuts down the conversation and reacts with anxiety or anger. So she's wanting to know how they can help him come to a place of acceptance, both of his diagnoses and himself. Christy, my heart just really goes out to your little guy. There's so much stigma surrounding the diagnoses of neurodivergence, and sometimes some of those neurodivergent kids have very strict black and white thinking, and it is easy to see how our kids internalize these messages that their neurodivergence is a failure. When you have one of those kids who has those really spiky profiles of strength and struggles, it can be really confusing when one thing comes really easily and another thing is so difficult. And the messages received from the educators and other students only compound that. They hear the message, how is it possible that this is so hard for you when that thing is so easy? So my question for you is this. How does your son recognize his strengths? Does he see the benefits of being neurodivergent in any way? Sometimes I like to use dialectical thinking in these situations with kids, which specifically just means moving from an either-or perspective to a both-and perspective. Instead of, you're really smart and being neurodivergent is always great, or it's bad and terrible and awful, we can move that to, sometimes there are things that are really great about being neurodivergent. Maybe you always strive for accuracy, and that's a really important skill. Or maybe you have really strong divergent thinking skills and creativity. And we can also recognize that there are difficulties that come along with all of these. That striving for accuracy might cause a lot of frustration when something is ambiguous or comes in shades of gray. That divergent thinking might cause problems when you come up with a different way of looking at something and others don't see it the same way. It's a double-edged sword, and sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's kind of a pain, but there's value in all of it. I think the age that he is really hard, but I'll also tell you that I have clients who are college age who still butt up against this in different situations, and we're consistently needing to reframe and find that shade of gray. It does become more automatic, but sometimes when there are new and different situations, we have to explore it yet again. So Adriana asks how she can ask as a parent for bullying to stop at her child's school. So when I think back on my time as a school counselor, I know that bullying was one of the most difficult things to handle. First, I had students and parents who didn't really understand what bullying was in the first place, so I often did a lot of education about that. And you may have teachers at the school who don't really get it either. Just so everyone's on the same page, I define bullying as having 3 main characteristics. First of all, it is targeted behavior, meaning that it is directed toward a specific person from someone else. Second, it's a repeated behavior that happens over and over again. And third, there's a power differential between the person who is engaging in the bullying behavior and the person who is on the receiving end. When you can go into the school and explain exactly how the behavior that your child is experiencing fits into each one of these 3 categories, it might really help them understand exactly what's happening and to understand that it is indeed bullying behavior and that they have an obligation to support your child. Probably the trickiest thing about bullying is that it is so insidious and difficult to see. So I'll share just a quick little story about my daughter who is in 8th grade, and she has a peer who was definitely engaging in some bullying behavior. The problem was that they had been friends previously, and at this age, it can often devolve into a she said type of situation. Ultimately, I did step in and intervene, and I was pleased with how the assistant principal responded. Basically, they put some parameters in place that said that the 2 of them were not to interact at all at any time. It was kind of a nuclear war mutual destruction type of strategy where they would each report if the other was in any way engaging or causing any problems. But for what it's worth, I think it worked. I know my daughter wasn't really the instigator or causing a lot of these problems. Yet I think the accountability helped to make sure that she wasn't going and just even talking to her friends about the situation. Depending on a child's age and depending on the environment, it can be hard for schools to figure out exactly how to fix those problems. But if it ends up coming down to allowing the bullying to continue versus having one or both of the children switch classes or some other relatively big interventions, it's important not only to protect the child who's being targeted, but also to teach them that it is okay to advocate and that people will help them. There's nothing worse than being bullied and feeling like there's nobody there to help or to listen. Sandra wants to know what specific steps can be taken to work with school administrators toward a neurodiversity-affirming school environment. So this is my area of passion, with helping schools create neurodiversity-affirming atmospheres. When I present on this topic to schools and do trainings for teachers, I break down 4 tenets that are necessary for a neurodiversity-affirming school environment. So the 4 aspects of a neurodiversity-affirming school that I see as the most important are these. First of all, we want to value differences in our students. This means that we recognize that there are all kinds of different brains who have all types of different needs, and there's no reason to try to create a one-size-fits-all environment. We also want our students to feel comfortable being their authentic selves. The second piece that I feel is important for this is to have a strength-based approach to supporting our students. Every student has different strengths, and we want to value and honor those, even when they aren't what we might typically expect to see. If you have a student who loves Pokemon or Minecraft or Roblox or whatever their obsession might be, we can integrate that into our relationships and our instruction. Now, strengths-based doesn't only mean interest-based, although that is one way that we might see it. But ultimately, we want our kids to know that they have those strengths. The third aspect is just having a collaborative staff. Part of the reason I think this is so important is because when I worked in the schools in the gifted education programs, I often felt like an island. I taught both in center-based gifted education programs, and I taught where I was the solo gifted ed teacher in the whole building. But either time, I often felt disconnected from the classroom teachers and the other support staff in the building. So for our neurodivergent kids, I just didn't always have the tools that I needed. Our schools have occupational therapists, speech-language pathologists, school counselors, special educators, gifted ed teachers, and gen ed teachers. And we need an opportunity to work together and collaborate and find the resources that work for our students. Sometimes people don't even know which staff member might be the best person for that resource, so we need to really encourage that collaboration. And the last piece that I feel is so important for neurodiversity-affirming schools is that they allow autonomy. You can view this in 2 ways. First of all, I think it's important that students are allowed autonomy because it's an inherent need for motivation. But I think the second piece that goes along with this is that the teachers also need to have a little bit of autonomy in order to meet the needs of their students. Depending on the school environment, there can be a lot of fear about stepping outside of the box or doing something different to support a student. But when we give teachers the autonomy to do so, not only do they meet the students' needs even better, but additionally, they feel motivated because they feel like they're making a difference in their job. Jenny has a neurodivergent high school freshman who needs some volunteer hours over the next 4 years. And she's wondering if I have any ideas for kids that are less socially inclined. She struggles sometimes with that line, whether or not to push him to just do it or make allowances for the fact that he is not neurotypical. But she also recognizes that she wouldn't ask for a pass on the hours because she does think that he needs the experience. So Jenny, I know exactly what you're talking about with those kids who are content to just kind of move along with the status quo and not step outside their comfort zone. The idea of volunteering can definitely be really uncomfortable, but in the long run, I think there's so much value to doing so. It can be hard to find opportunities, though, for volunteering based on a student's age. Frequently, faith communities might have opportunities for youth volunteering and community service. However, not everybody has that connection, or their faith community might not have a robust process in place for doing so. Sometimes schools have clubs that they can participate in, and that might offer volunteer opportunities. Things like Key Club or Student Council. And depending on your school, those might be open to anyone who chooses to join. However, I recognize that for the types of kids that we're talking about, that might be really overwhelming. You might reach out to the school counselor to see if they have any suggestions on what other kids have done. And sometimes there are opportunities at local summer day camps to help out as, say, counselors in training. Activities like the Special Olympics are often looking for volunteers to help with the athletes. And I know that our local library has a summer reading program, and they're often looking for teen volunteers to help out with that program. I don't know that I have any amazing novel ideas specifically for those kids who are super introverted and hesitant about trying new things, but perhaps this would be a great conversation for us to continue over in our Facebook group, and some other people might have some good ideas too. So Rebecca has a neurodivergent first grader who struggles with attention and listening. Other people see it as obstinate or possibly ignoring, but they know that they could offer a lifetime supply of favorite treats and still get no response at times. At home, they can be patient and build extra time into the schedule, but at school, the teacher really struggles. It sounds like your first grader definitely requires some extra time for processing speed, which could be a component of what's going on. Additionally, difficulties with transition are characteristic of lots of neurodivergent kids. This might mean that they are just so focused on what they're doing that they're unaware of what's going on around them and unaware of the expectation that they're supposed to be transitioning to something new. Or it could be that they are engaged in something and have a plan or expectation in their own mind for what that path is going to look like, and they're unable to adjust quickly and easily to what is being asked of them. I would suggest some accommodations, such as maybe a visual cue that might help your child be more prepared for a transition. For example, maybe the teacher could have a specific card, like an index card, that they put on the child's desk when the transition is getting ready to happen. There might even be several cards, so one for when they are preparing to transition, one for when they are just about to begin the transition, and one when it is actually time to engage in that transition. Sometimes those visual cues can be really helpful. I would also have the teacher create a very specific list of the exact detailed steps that are required when those transitions occur or when their attention is needed. Another thing the teacher can do would be to isolate one specific recurring time or occasion when they notice the child is mostly struggling with that attention or listening piece, and target that specific incident first, rather than expecting your child to generalize that skill to be able to do it throughout the entire day. Once they have some success at that one particular time or situation, then moving on to the others can be a bit easier. Sherry is looking for a good checklist template for ADHD students for both home and school. Her own child keeps forgetting to do certain portions of afternoon chores, and students are struggling with organization and planning things out. She's leaning toward a good visual checklist that would benefit both, but she's wondering where a good place is to get one. So Sherry, I've got good news and I've got bad news. I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is that I don't know of any ideal, perfect, wonderful checklist templates for ADHD kids. The good news is that means that you can come up with your own or try a million different ideas to see what sticks. What we have to remember about ADHD brains is that they thrive on novelty. So even if you found the perfect checklist template, it probably is not going to work forever. You're going to have to switch it up, and that can feel really frustrating. Probably the best idea I can give you is to try a bunch of different things. I've done this before when I've run executive functioning groups for students, where I get online and print off about 1 million, okay, that's an exaggeration, but a whole lot of different planner types and templates, and I just say, pick one. What style appeals to you? What do you think might work? And let's give it a week, and then they can give that a try. I think as far as a visual checklist goes, again, making your own that's tailored to the specific task is probably going to be a better tool. Does the child prefer to physically check off the items off the list with a pen or a pencil? Or do they want a little magnet or a clip or something that they can move around? Do they want to, set a goal for themselves for how many tasks they might be able to work through in a week? Whatever it is that might motivate them in the moment can be useful. I also think there's value in helping kids learn how to make these types of checklists for themselves. Ultimately, I think that tailoring these for our kids is probably the best path forward. Julie is curious about the story with the ADHD meds. She could only get 20 doses, less than 1 month on a 90-day prescription from her pharmacy. The pharmacy, she says, has moved mountains for her over the years with other prescriptions, so she expects that they have their act together, and she's very concerned about this. So what's up? I know it is super frustrating when you call the pharmacy and you cannot get the medications that you or your child needs. There are a couple of different things that are going on. If you don't do a lot of research, the common knowledge that you'll get is that it's basically a supply and demand issue, which is probably part of the issue. I think there are a lot more people who are getting diagnosed with ADHD and are trying to use medications and are realizing how beneficial they are, so that can be a component. But there's actually something that is much bigger going on, probably even more frustrating than the other, because if it was a supply and demand issue, wouldn't you think that the pharmaceutical companies would just make more? So this actually has to do with the opioid crisis and the recent settlements that happened with some of those companies that were responsible for it. Basically, part of the settlement in those cases resulted in the DEA making very specific requirements for pharmacies about what types of prescriptions they can order at any individual time. So what this means is that they are only allowed to have a certain percentage of the prescriptions that they are providing to patients that fall into that controlled substance category. The problem with having it as a certain percentage is that it is a ratio, and it's not a quantifiable number because it's based on what other prescriptions are being ordered at that time. What this means for pharmacies is that a lot of times they may have ordered a certain medication, but they literally have no idea when they will be able to get it because it is bound to these proportional requirements set by the DEA. This is because all the stimulant medications used with ADHD fall into that same category as the opioid medications. It's kind of wild, but that's what's happening. Although I do feel like this is a problem that could be solved. However, I know that a lot of us are doing that monthly wild goose chase to try to find those medications and track them down so we can have them. Some of us are rationing our medications to make sure that we have them for the days that we really need them. And none of that is good. But it is interesting to see how this has changed all of a sudden, but it is not just because there are a bunch of people who are out there seeking medication for ADHD who weren't before. Jeremy wants to know what some of my takeaways were from the ADHD conference in Baltimore. So back at the beginning of December, I was able to go to the International ADHD Conference, which was sponsored by several organizations, including the CHAD organization. I presented twice, once on suicidality and self-injury in ADHD individuals, and once on the mental health crisis with adolescent ADHD girls. I made that presentation with Dr. Sharon Saline and Dr. Brandy Walker. However, I actually ended up leaving after just one full day and a morning at the conference, so I didn't get the full experience. Nonetheless, some of my main takeaways from the sessions that I was able to attend include the presentation on assessing for ADHD. First of all, I learned that the Conners scale has an observer tool, which can be used for adult ADHD assessment and diagnosis and can help evaluators have a more well-rounded view of someone's needs by having a partner or a parent or a close friend complete a questionnaire just to get another perspective of how that person is impacted. I also liked that this particular presenter made a point to say that there is really no such thing as an objective assessment or questionnaire, even when you are using the continuous performance tests, which give you a quantitative result. That's because it's all based on how the assessor brings everything together. So when you interpret those reports, you are coming to it with a subjective view, and you have to use your best judgment and training to come to a diagnostic decision. The other thing that stood out to me was the keynote speaker, Cassandra Arson, and she talked about breaking down the different ways that people deal with clutter. So basically, what she said was that there are people who are visual and need to see all of their stuff in order to stay organized. I would fall into that category because I'm a piler. She also talked about how some people need more details versus big picture, And she has broken people into those 4 categories and come up with some organizational systems that work for each person's type of brain. You can check out more about her and that information at her website, which is clutterbug.me. Okay, our last question for today comes from Jenny, and she is curious about chronic pain or migraines and neurodivergence. So she grew up with migraines and thought that those caused her to be more sensitive, but now she's wondering whether being sensitive was the thing that led to the migraines, kind of a classic chicken and egg scenario. Since having kids, she also notes she would self-diagnose as ADHD with sensory processing disorder and maybe even autism. So Jenny, I'm going to try to answer this for you, but I want you to keep in mind that I am not a medical professional in this area, and I don't want to speak out of turn. So I'm saying everything with a great deal of caution. However, when I go to Google Scholar and do a quick search for autism specifically and chronic pain, a whole bunch of scholarly articles pop up. For example, autism is highly correlated with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a condition of the connective tissues that influences hypermobility and can cause additional pain and sensory processing issues when somebody is needing to stand or walk for long amounts of time, or during other basic life activities like that. Additionally, there is some research that shows that all of those connective tissues, which is basically all of your body, influence how your body experiences pain. I didn't do an exhaustive search. However, I know that a lot of my neurodivergent clients experience what you're talking about, specifically with migraines. But when you think about it, it makes sense. Like if you have increased sensory sensitivity, say specifically to light, that's probably something that could trigger a migraine for you. So I don't necessarily have a great answer as to why, only just to validate for you that this does seem to be a common experience and it does seem to be related in some way to being neurodivergent. Okay, everyone, that's about it for today. We will be gathering more questions for our next AMA in our Facebook group, the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group. I appreciate you listening. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.